Unless something drastically changes, LaNorris Sellers is likely going to be a first-time starter for the Gamecocks in 2024, and the season that he has later this fall could wind up being better than some of his predecessors.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Major Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecock Digest over on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or your first watch for your team every day. We are free and available both wherever you get your audio podcasts daily and also on YouTube. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as new customers can join today and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. We got a lot that we're going to touch on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. We're going to talk about South Carolina's baseball team a little bit for the first time in a very long while. As opening day is just a few days away, we'll be talking about the infield for the Gamecocks at the end of the show. We'll also be talking about the men's basketball game that's going to take place on Wednesday night against the Auburn Tigers and why that game is so important for the Gamecocks. But to start off today's show, we're going to talk a little bit of football. And specifically, we're going to talk about LaNorris Sellers. Because although South Carolina has made several additions to the quarterback room this offseason, it's looking likely that LaNorris Sellers is probably going to be the starting quarterback for South Carolina in 2024, which means that he is going to be a first-time starter. And when comparing LaNorris Sellers' possible outcome as a first-time starter to guys that were first-time starters in the past for the Gamecocks at the quarterback position, I think that LaNorris Sellers has a good chance to outperform all of them. Now, when looking at recent first-time starters for South Carolina to talk about for this conversation, there were a couple of pieces of criteria that I had here. One, we're not going to talk about any transfer quarterbacks that joined the football program at a later stage in their college career. So we're not going to talk about Spencer Rattler, and we're not going to talk about Colin Hill. Also, we're not going to talk about guys who were basically fourth-year juniors or seniors by the time they did become a full-time starter. So for that reason, we're not going to talk about Dylan Thompson, and we're not going to talk about Perry Orth's lone season as a starter in 2015. The guys that we're going to talk about for the purposes of this discussion are Stephen Garcia from what he did back in 2008, Connor Shaw, what he did back in 2011, Jake Bentley and what he accomplished in 2016, and Ryan Hilinski and how he performed in 2019. So let's start off this conversation with the two most recent first-time starters for South Carolina, and those quarterbacks were Jake Bentley and Ryan Hilinski. Now, why do I think LaNorris Sellers' first year as a starter is going to be better than what Hilinski and Bentley both did in their first years as starters here at South Carolina? Well, the reasoning here is pretty simple and self-explanatory. LaNorris Sellers has got more talent around him on this year's team than either of those guys had. When you look at Jake Bentley back in 2016, obviously that was the first year of the Will Muschamp tenure. South Carolina, for the past several recruiting cycles leading into that season, they had recruited well on paper in terms of the final rankings, but they had not done a very good job of developing guys, or quite frankly, they took players that were not living up to the ranking and star status that they had. And so because of that, when you look at Jake Bentley and what he had compared to what LaNorris Sellers has, it's pretty clear and obvious. Jake Bentley had a worse running back room, offensive line, and also offensive coordinator. He had Kurt Roper as his offensive coordinator in 2016. And I think that it's definitely fair to say, as of right now, that Donald Loggins is definitely a much better offensive coordinator than Kurt Roper was for South Carolina. Now let's look at Ryan Hilinski real quick. Very, very similar situation, except for Hilinski had it worse than Jake Bentley on paper. Hilinski had a worse running back room than what LaNorris Sellers is going to have this coming fall. And he had a wide receiver core that had a couple real notable names. Guys in Brian Edwards and Shi Smith, two guys from the state of South Carolina growing up. But the wide receiver core was top heavy at best. Behind those two guys, there really was not a whole lot of talent to speak of on this roster. And yes, that roster did include Josh Vann and Xavier Legette, but I'm talking about what South Carolina had from those guys during that season. Obviously, Legette went on to be a great receiver in his final year here. Josh Vann did some nice things, but at that point in time, they weren't ready to contribute. South Carolina has more guys ready to contribute wide receiver this season compared to what Hilinski had to work with in 2019. And then you look at the offensive line. That offensive line unit had only a couple of NFL caliber players. I believe right now, South Carolina has 5 or 6 NFL caliber offensive linemen on the roster. And again, in terms of the offensive coordinator, the play caller that Hilinski had, I think that he has it worse off than what Sellers is going to have working with Dowell Loggins here in 2024. I believe that Hilinski's coordinator that season was actually Brian McClendon, who since then has not been a play caller, if that tells you anything with how that season went, if you forgot. So now that we talked about Jake Bentley and Ryan Hilinski, let's talk about Connor Shaw and Stephen Garcia and how their situations compare to LaNorris Sellers. Now, in those two situations, it's different from the previous two guys in the sense that Stephen Garcia and Connor Shaw both had talent around them, especially Connor Shaw with what he inherited in 2011. And Stephen Garcia, he also had some pretty solid talent when he took over the quarterback job in 2008 under then head coach Steve Spurrier. The reason that I think LaNorris Sellers could have a better year than both of those guys is because I think that Sellers, in terms of pure individual talent, is better than both Connor Shaw and Stephen Garcia. Connor Shaw, as I mentioned earlier, he definitely had more talent around him. If we're going to take one of these two rosters between the 2011 offense and the 2024 offense for South Carolina, you're probably taking that 2011 offense 9 times out of 10. But Connor Shaw, as much as I know Gamecock fans love him, and as great of a quarterback as he was in terms of winning a lot of games, Shaw was definitely limited in terms of his arm strength. He was not a guy that was known for being able to throw bombs deep down the field on shot plays. He definitely could run with the football. He had straight line speed, but he couldn't necessarily break a lot of tackles, and he wasn't necessarily a guy that was going to put defenders on skates in the open field. LaNorris Sellers has the ability to do both of those things, along with run almost as fast as Connor Shaw in terms of straight line speed. So you throw all that together, I think that LaNorris, he has a chance to have a better year than Connor Shaw had statistically in that regard. And then Stephen Garcia. Garcia did not have the offense that Connor Shaw had in 2011 by any means. He had a worse running back room, a worse tight end room, and compared to what LaNorris Sellers is going to have along the offensive line in 2024, looking at that 2008 team, you could say that those two units are kind of comparable in terms of the future NFL talent that both rosters possess. But obviously, we all know what the deal was with Stephen Garcia. He himself has admitted it in future years since his playing days have ended. He just did not have his head on straight at all times. And obviously, that made for a lot of fun stories off the field, but it also prematurely ended his South Carolina football playing career. LaNorris Sellers, I think it is fair to say, he's not going to have that issue. LaNorris Sellers has been a great student athlete on and off the field so far here at South Carolina. He was highly commended for what all he did in the classroom as well as on the field when he was playing football at South Florence High School. So don't think that's going to be a problem. And again, just in terms of pure talent, I think that you got to say LaNorris Sellers beats out Stephen Garcia in that regard. So whether it is the talent that he has around him compared to recent first-time stars for South Carolina or his own individual talent, I think that LaNorris Sellers, being a first-time starter later this fall, he is going to have a better season than all of those guys had when they were first-time starters for the Gamecocks. I think it's going to be a solid year for LaNorris Sellers. We also do have to remember, and I have to remember myself, He's going to be a redshirt freshman, which means sometimes he is going to make redshirt freshman mistakes. He is certainly not going to be perfect, but I think LaNorris Sellers has a chance to have a really solid first-year campaign here as the starting quarterback for South Carolina's football team. Now, Lamont Paris and the men's basketball team, they're not going to be playing later tonight. Feels a little bit odd, the fact they're not going to be playing a Tuesday night game for the first time in who knows how many weeks, but they are going to be traveling over to Auburn on Wednesday night. That's going to be a big game for several different reasons because South Carolina could help themselves in many different ways should they exit that game with a win. We'll talk about what all they could do for themselves in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. I know a lot of NBA fans like to follow individual players throughout the league, and we're a little over halfway into the regular season, which means that the MVP odds are starting to tighten up a little bit. Nikola Jokic, his odds are set at -140 as the favorite. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander from Oklahoma City, his odds are at +270. And Giannis Antetokounmpo, who's won the MVP before, his odds are set at +650. So, if you want to bet on who's going to win the regular season MVP, or maybe look at some quick bets, some same-game parlays, and exclusive props, just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and shoot your shot with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Welcome back to this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily choice for South Carolina Gamecock sports coverage. Wednesday night's matchup between Lamont Paris and South Carolina's men's basketball team versus the Auburn Tigers over in the state of Alabama is going to be a very important game for the Gamecocks, because if South Carolina is able to win this matchup, and it's certainly going to be difficult, we'll do a bigger preview on this game on the Wednesday show. Plan to have Locked On Auburn Zach Blackerby on the show to give y'all some better insight on the Auburn Tigers basketball team, but if South Carolina can pull this off, it would do several things for them. Let's talk about, first of all, the SEC regular season title race. Obviously, if the Gamecocks were to pull out the victory here, they would increase the cushion that they have between themselves and the Auburn Tigers in this case. As a reminder right now, with the current standings, South Carolina and Alabama are tied for first place at 9-2. Tennessee is in fourth place at 7-3, and Auburn is currently in third place sitting at 8-2. So, if Auburn wins this game tomorrow night, they officially create a three-way tie once again for first place in the SEC, and South Carolina now is losing the tiebreaker to both Bama and Auburn. They will not get a rematch with the Tigers at home later in the regular season. But if the Gamecocks pull out the win, South Carolina takes sole possession of first place in the SEC, because I believe this is Alabama's bye week, so they're not playing a midweek conference game here. That would be a huge deal for South Carolina in terms of this regular season title race. Now, another reason why this game is really important for Lamont Paris and the Gamecocks is the fact that they're going to have a better chance to get maybe a better seeding in the NCAA tournament field should they win this game. We're going to talk about something that I know South Carolina fans hate a lot right now, and that is the computer models that are used in men's college basketball. I understand it. Y'all don't like KenPom, you don't like the net rankings, and I have to admit myself, I do not fully understand how those models get the final results or calculations that they spit out. I don't get it myself, but we all have to acknowledge this. The computers do play a role in the selection committee's decisions on where all these teams are going to be slotted in the field of 68 for the NCAA tournament. It's not entirely what they make their decisions upon, but it does play a pretty significant role. In terms of the net rankings, just addressing that real quick, There are two main reasons why South Carolina is not being valued as highly in those rankings right now compared to some other SEC teams. One, the non-conference schedule in retrospect, it is hurting South Carolina. It is not helping them that they have faced 6 teams that are currently ranked 299th or worse in the net rankings. And again, that is out of 362 Division I men's basketball teams. It also doesn't help you that you were a double-digit favorite against a VMI team and Charleston Southern team that are a part of that group that I just mentioned, and you beat both of those teams by a combined 14 points. I know that this team's a lot better than what they were earlier in the season or how they performed earlier in the season, but it doesn't matter for the net rankings. They view all these games in equal light. I don't agree with that. I'm sure none of y'all agree with that, but that's just the way it is. The other thing that's hurting South Carolina right now is this. Subsequently, along with the weak non-con schedule, they have a lack of big games that they have played to this point in the season. Up to this point, South Carolina has only played 10 Quad 1 or Quad 2 games. The only SEC team that has played the same amount of games in this regard is the Ole Miss Rebels. They have also played 10 Quad 1 and Quad 2 games combined. So, that's going to start to change on Wednesday night because Auburn is absolutely a Quad 1 opportunity. If South Carolina were to win that game, you will start to see the net rankings change significantly for the Gamecocks over the next several weeks. The last reason why this is a very important game, and winning this game would be huge for this team, is the fact that next week is South Carolina's bye week. If South Carolina can defeat Auburn in Neville Arena and then take care of the LSU Tigers on Saturday, a team that they're going to be playing at home, and they should be with how the matchup's going to work out, in my opinion, then they would head into next week with a lot of momentum. And also, we have to be honest, this team, I think, is close to the point where they really and truthfully need an extended break. The two players that really come to mind here are BJ Mack and Talon Cooper. BJ Mack, with the way that he plays, playing around 30 minutes a game or 28 minutes a game, beating and banging down low in the low post, and then also going out to the three-point line and running a bunch of slip screens to try to give himself a three-point shot. I think it's fair to say that that started to take a toll on BJ Mack in terms of his full game performances over the past couple of games. And then Talon Cooper. The guy is just playing a significant amount of minutes for this team right now. As a matter of fact, in his past 9 games, Cooper is averaging 36.1 minutes played per contest. So South Carolina's point guard and arguably their most versatile front court player right now, I would say they're both running on fumes. It is a good thing for them that they're getting an extra day of rest before this Auburn game's taking place. But yeah, they need the week-long rest. Here's the other thing that we need to talk about here. I know that for some of y'all who pay more attention to football than basketball, when you hear bye week, you kind of sit there and think to yourself, well, that could either be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. Obviously, for the Gamecocks on the football field last season, it didn't work out for them because they made good changes on offense, but the defense was the exact same, and it cost them their very next football game. That's not exactly the case when it comes to basketball, at least for this season. I heard a very interesting factoid on Southeastern 14. They are another podcast that covers the Southeastern Conference and football, basketball, you name it. I was listening to some of their guys talk about the basketball teams recently and doing some previews, and they made the following statement. They basically said that to this point in the season in the SEC, every time a team has come off a bye week and faced a team that didn't have a bye week the previous week, they won that basketball game. South Carolina is going to play Ole Miss 2 Saturdays from now, who not only has to play in the middle of next week, but the Rebels are going to be playing a rivalry game against the Mississippi State Bulldogs on the road on Wednesday night, just 3 nights before South Carolina travels to Oxford to play Ole Miss. So, quick early preview for that game. That might favor the Gamecocks in that instance. But overall, looking at this Auburn game, it is a humongous game. It's not just the fact that both of these teams are ranked right now. South Carolina has a chance to really establish a foothold in this SEC regular season title race and potentially put Auburn on the brink of elimination in terms of how their future schedule shapes up. Also, the Gamecocks, they could give themselves a chance to have a higher seed in the NCAA tournament if they win this kind of game on the road. And also, they need this bye week, but they got to take care of business before the bye week gets here. If you win this game and take care of business against LSU on Saturday, you will increase your winning streak to 9 games in conference play, and you'll have a ton of momentum along with the rest that they will deserve this next week. So, massive matchup coming up for the Gamecocks on Wednesday night. Another team that's going to be playing not tomorrow, but later this week for the first time in their respective season will be South Carolina's baseball team. We're going to talk about a couple of different position groups for this team over the next few days. Today, we're going to start off with the infield. And this infield, in my opinion, it's got a chance to really be dangerous for opposing pitchers when it comes to the variety of skill sets that they will have approaching the plate. We'll talk about all of that in just a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience is what brings home the winning trophy and also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, and LED headlights, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. Heading into this upcoming baseball season for the South Carolina Gamecocks, there's been a lot of discussion about the Gamecocks batting lineup and potentially just how powerful it could be at the plate. And when starting today's previews here with the infield for the Gamecocks, there's no question that this group is going to make an impact at the plate for South Carolina this spring. And the thing that's great about the infield and the skill sets that they possess in terms of their batting approach is that all of these guys, they offer different things. So we'll start off with the power bats. Obviously, everybody loves to see the long ball. Everybody loves to see home runs hit over the fence at Founders Park. So we'll begin this discussion with Cole Messina and Gavin Casas. Both of these guys are obviously more so pull hitters than anything else, meaning that they usually pull the ball to their side of the field that they are batting on. Gavin Casas did show some signs last year of being a guy that could push the ball to the opposite side of the field, which is certainly valuable for a guy that is as powerful as he is at the plate. And both of these guys, they played a huge role in South Carolina's offensive outburst in 2023, as they both hit 17 home runs and 19 home runs, respectively. Messina hitting 17 and Casas hitting 19 this past spring. Now, the next couple guys we're going to talk about, they're not really known for their power at the plate like Cole Messina and Gavin Casas are. But these two guys, they can be really, really pesky at bats for opposing pitchers because of the plate discipline that they possess. And the two guys I'm talking about here are Talmadge LeCroy and Carson Hornung. Now, Carson is listed as an infielder on the official roster for the baseball team, which I have to be honest with y'all, I don't pay much attention to the baseball team before the season starts because I don't really put too much weight into what happens in fall practice. I don't put a whole lot of weight in what happens in non-con play outside the Clemson series. I put the most weight on what happens the first couple weeks of SEC play. At that point, we find out what kind of team the Gamecocks are going to be. But I have seen that Hornung is apparently now an infielder, which is a very interesting positional change for him. But when talking about their plate appearances, their approach at the plate, Hornung is a guy that just sees the ball better than anybody else on this entire roster and probably most guys in the SEC. Because in 2023, in 117 at-bats, Hornung had a 1.00 strikeout to walk ratio, dead even. So anytime he got struck out, the very next at bat, Hornung was likely going to draw a walk from the same pitching staff. Talmadge LeCroy. The thing about him is when you look at his numbers, he does not have that same kind of low strikeout to walk ratio. But what Hornung does have is an ability to really fight off pitches. He is a guy that is going to force pitchers sometimes to have to expend a lot of energy, have to throw 6 pitches, maybe 7 pitches or more in order to get him out. He's basically going to put the ball in the field a lot more than other guys in his position, and he is going to make you earn your out against him. He's going to very rarely be a 3-pitch and out kind of batter in this lineup for South Carolina. So while Cole Messina and Gavin Costas are 2 guys that are going to hit the ball deep and possibly out of the playing field, Talmadge LeCroy and Carson Hornung, they do a lot more of the little things at the plate in order to get on base. So guys like Messina and Costas can take full advantage whenever they connect on any kind of pitch. Now, the wild card out of this group this year, I'm not going to pick any of the newcomers. I'm not going to pick any of the true freshmen that have enrolled here out of high school. I'm going to talk about Will Tippett. Will Tippett got some starting experience on this team this past spring. And the thing that we all saw with Will Tippett is he was a guy that was certainly fast on the base pads when he got going this past spring. And in terms of his fielding, he was certainly one of the better fielders, I would say, in the infield for South Carolina. He was someone that displayed really good range, so he could cover a lot of ground really quickly, going back to his speed, and also his reaction skills were quite good as well. So very rarely did Will Tippett allow a line drive or ground ball to get past him if he had a decent enough opportunity to go and get it. He didn't always make the play, necessarily getting the guy out at first, but he did a good job of limiting the damage, so to speak, when he was out there in the field. Now, the biggest drawback with Tippett being in the lineup last year was the fact that his bat just wasn't all that great. He had a really good stretch late in the regular season when South Carolina desperately needed it with all the injuries they were dealing with at the time. But outside of, say, a 2-week stretch there towards the end of the regular season, Will Tippett, he just never really consistently showed up at the plate. From what has been said this offseason, what all has come out of South Carolina's dugout in the clubhouse, it appears that Will Tippett has added a lot of strength this offseason and apparently has a lot more power behind his swing when he connects on pitches. So, Will Tippett is a guy that, depending on how much he's improved at the plate this offseason, he could really make this infield just one of the best in the entire country in terms of what they do at the plate. They're not going to be known for their defense. Tippett's pretty much the only plus fielder, I would say, that they have in this current infield as it's projected right now. But in terms of what they're going to do at the plate, Cole Messina, Gavin Costas, and the rest of these guys, they're going to do a lot of damage this spring in their own different ways. So the infield for South Carolina, full of experience and full of star power, and definitely full of power in terms of their bats at the plate. And you could say the same thing about the outfield potentially as well. We'll talk about those guys a lot more on tomorrow's show. But with that being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Thank y'all so much for tuning in as always. What are y'all's thoughts on LaNorris Sellers and what he could do as a first-time starter for the Gamecocks in 2024 compared to what other recent first-time starters have done in Columbia over the past 15 years or so? What are your thoughts on how important this men's basketball game is tonight against the Auburn Tigers and what it could do for Lamont Paris and his squad? And lastly, what are your overall opinions on the Gamecocks infield for their baseball team heading into the 2024 season? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section if you watch today's show on YouTube, or you can shoot me a direct message on X at @alion_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. As always, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.